All right, I'll go ahead and get us started then. Oh, okay. I'm gonna assume we're good to start. Okay, good morning everyone and happy Halloween, as you can tell from what we've got going on over here today. I know you might have some questions about what's going on with the screen here and why we have this very gorgeous but kind of random logo that doesn't seem to have too much to do with homelessness up on the screen. But I'll explain what's going on and a little bit about the session and how it's going to be a little different. So just bear with me and it will all make a little bit of sense. Sorry, not used to. I'm very fidgety, so this is... Anyway, to introduce myself, my name is Promise Basulwa, and I'm a Senior Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, which we call the COH for short. My area of expertise is around knowledge mobilization, and so for work, I use my communication skill set in things like writing or graphic design, and more recently, creative direction, to take findings from research and reframe them in ways that are easier for wider audiences to understand, because as a lot of us know, the average person doesn't get to be in spaces like these and also doesn't have time to regularly read giant reports, but might still be invested in learning about these topics. So my job generally is to bridge that knowledge gap and get everybody to a point where they're able to access key information and learnings. Just do that. Part of that work involves leading and coordinating Prevention Matters, which is an online educational series that we've been doing at the COH since the start of the year. And we host approachable conversations on this series about how homelessness prevention looks in different contexts. Most of us know that prevention is necessary if we want to solve the current housing crisis, but the series exists in the way that it does because if we want to address homelessness through prevention, then we have to be clear on what prevention means. And so, what can we do to reduce the chances that someone will experience homelessness in the first place? What can be done to support people who are at a high risk of homelessness or who have recently become homeless? And how can we ensure that people who have experienced homelessness and who are now housed don't face housing precarity again? To delve into these questions, Prevention Matters invites brilliant minds to tell us about how prevention looks in their work, along with the lessons they've learned along the way. The whole premise of the show more broadly is to connect with a wider audience and, like I said, as extension of some of the other work I'm doing, share knowledge in a way that's more engaging. And so as a result, our online show operates less like a traditional webinar series and more a little bit like a panel conversation or a talk show. We've hosted 8 online discussions so far, and if you've attended them, then you'll know that they're all great and inspiring in their own ways. But before this conference, we actually hadn't been able to do any in person yet in a room full of people. So it's really cool that you guys are now our second in-person audience that we've had as a part of the show. Which means that this is going to look a little different from some of the other sessions that you've attended since the start of the conference. Sorry, just looking for my place in my script. Give me a sec. Okay, yeah. So, like I was saying, it's going to look a little different from what else you've been to at this conference. Today's guests will start by briefly presenting on their work or talking about it and giving us an overview, but the format is going to be, like I said, that talk show panel format, so it's going to be largely conversational. Today's conversation is going to inspire some hope by highlighting some proven interventions that prevent youth homelessness. So we're going to be looking at a couple of research-backed examples to highlight how we can prevent youth homelessness through direct service provision, but also through broader services broader approaches, that target things like policy, advocacy, and educational pieces to support our young people. At the end of the day, prevention is bigger than one person, one group, or even one particular system. And so today's conversation is going to basically shine a spotlight on what it takes to bring everyone together and make long-term change possible. Before we get into it, though, it's important to pay respect to the traditional guardians of the land on which we're gathering today. So I will open us up with a land acknowledgement before handing over to Erica. The 2024 National Conference on Ending Homelessness is being held on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples. The peoples of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness acknowledges the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast who participate in this work who participate in this conference, and lead the work to end homelessness across Turtle Island. So that's all from me for now. I just wanted to start off by giving you some context. I'll be back at the end to tell you a little more about the series and how you can get involved in our usual online show. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Erica so we can get to the fun part and hear from our guests. Okay. Or maybe we'll take a second.
Yeah, we're delaying, I guess, 15 minutes because the morning got delayed. So I was just told to start 15 minutes later.
So like I got to redo the whole intro?
Sorry, everyone. This is pause for 10 minutes. Yeah, and then we can just pick up where we left off, maybe.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry.
I don't know, talk amongst yourselves. Ask our panelists about their costumes. They have lots of fun things to tell you about them.
Reflect on what you've heard so far and what you anticipate from the session. Sorry. This is live, folks. That's true.
Yeah, sure. Go outside, grab a friend, tell them we have costumes on and it's appealing. I guess we'll be back in 10 to 15 minutes.
Yep.
All right. Okay, this time I'm going to wait for the room coordinators. Are we good to start? Yeah? Okay. No, I mean, if we need to wait for more people, I don't mind. I think we're pretty much full. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, there's more seats at the front. Don't be shy.
We're not going to breathe fire on you just because we...
The costumes are just costumes. We swear we're harmless.
No real witches. That's right. Magical unicorns. We got Paw Patrol.
Yeah. We got some right at the front here. I had a feeling. We'll give it a moment. It's all good.
Take a chair. Yes.
Okay, now are we good? Okay, 1 second. Of course the PowerPoint's not opening now. Guys, give me a second. I've lost the mouse. Okay, here we go. All right, if you're joining us just now, you missed something really cool because I gave a whole introduction about the show, the series, and why the session is different. I'm not going to go over it again for the sake of not boring everyone to tears. But very briefly, today's conversation is going to be a little different from what we usually do at conferences like these. I work for an organization called the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and while I'm not a researcher, I have a skill set in communications that I use for knowledge mobilization type work. So for the people who aren't familiar with the jargon, what that means is taking research and the learnings from research, which is often not written in the most accessible language, no shade, and making it easier for other audiences to understand, because the average frontline provider is not reading a bunch of reports all the time. They're kind of too busy doing the frontline service provision. So the essence of my role is that I do a lot of different things to make research easier for wider audiences to understand. And by extension of that, we've been running a kind of panel talk show thing at the COH since the start of the year that's called Prevention Matters. And the idea with that show has been to move away from a traditional webinar format and do something that's a little more conversational, a little easier to follow, and just have more grounded conversations about the work that we're doing, as opposed to very formalized discussions with a little time for questions at the end. So by extension of that series, what you're sitting in is one of our first ever opportunities to do it in person. Since the start of the year, we've had 8 episodes of this online. And this conference has been the first opportunity that we've been able to do it in front of a live audience. We had one on the Tuesday morning that Ben was in. I can see you here. Hi, Ben. That went pretty well, and we're very excited about this one as well. It's basically going to be all about interventions that have a strong research base for youth homelessness prevention. So we're just going to look at a couple different ways that youth homelessness prevention works and kind of talk about the idea that it's always going to be bigger than one solution, one system, one intervention. There's actually a lot of different angles you have to come at it from, right? So that's basically what our panelists are going to get into in just a bit. And I'll be back at the end to tell you a little more about the show in case you missed my whole spiel. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Erica to start us off.
Great. Thanks, Promise. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Hello. Happy Halloween, by the way, if you didn't catch the vibe up here. I also feel like I have to shout out, it's my mom's birthday today. So while I'm wearing a witch hat, I'm actually channeling her. I'm dressed like her. I'm wearing her pants, and if you see me stand like this, I'm 100% 100% Beatrice Morton. Having said that, my name's Erica Morton. I use she and her pronouns. Part of the team at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. I'm going to moderate this awesome conversation today. I have the really fun job of having to maybe cut people off when they're talking, including my wonderful coworker, Jackie, and my big boss, Steve Gaetz. So send me your loving thoughts and prayers in case I have to be a big time jerk when people are chatting. No, I'm just joking. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm glad you're all here. I feel like you guys are like the diehards. You're here the last day, the last session, you know? So, yeah. So having said that, I'm probably forgetting something, but let's get into the part of the panel where we're going to do some sort of setting the stage, getting into the context. Promise said this earlier, but we're asking each person to present just sort of an overview of their work. So we're going to start with Steve Gaetz, and then from there we'll have Rebecca Stroud and Jackie Kennelly, and then Jacqueline Sohn. So maybe we'll just have you take it away, Steve.
Great. There's a lot of Jackies on it.
There's a lot of Jackies, yeah.
So thanks everyone. Because of the delay, it's created an inflationary effect. And so rather than 8 minutes, we've got 9. So here we go. So we're going to talk about family and natural supports, both as a philosophy of practice, but also as a program model. And this approach, the pioneers in this space would be Eva's Initiatives in Toronto, Covenant House in Toronto, and Boys and Girls Clubs in Calgary. So things have developed. The knowledge base has advanced quite a lot since these things were first started. So why family and natural supports? The research shows, including from Reaching Home, point in time counts, that when adults identify the main reason they become homeless, they tend to focus on economic matters. I don't have enough money for my rent, that kind of thing. For youth, it's overwhelmingly family conflict and breakdown that they cite as the cause for, and our research backs that up as well. And I think that family conflict and also neglect and abuse are part of the background of young people experience homelessness. It has created an effect on the way we respond to youth homelessness. And so, you know, one of the things that happens is when young people wind up leaving home, the family often disappears from the equation because we think young people now have to be protected from families rather than see family as a resource. So the family natural supports approach basically is based on the assumption or the end knowledge that family can and does matter to many people, even if they've had difficult relations with family members, that all young people will do better if they have adult supports in their life. All of us. Think of that, you know, will know that personally. And so why would we consider that young people experiencing homelessness don't need that kind of supports? So there are two kinds of relationships. Or first, you know, when we talk about family and natural supports, when we talk about natural supports, we're referring to meaningful adults in a young person's life. It could be a teacher, a coach, an art instructor, but somebody who they may look up to or they can discuss things with. And there's two kinds of key relationships. So bonding supports, these are ones that are important in the context of family. So a young person might have come from a home with difficulties with family. It doesn't mean that every family member they have difficulties with. It doesn't mean that there's no chance of redeeming a family kind of relationship. So bridging ties are weaker, and this is where more the natural supports might be, where you know, your teacher can help you problem solve. There can be mentoring, coaching. Where's Naomi? Right? That these things can be there. And the great thing about enhancing family and natural supports is it's more sustainable than professional supports, right? And so we all will do better if we have those kind of supports in our lives. Okay, so why does it matter? In our research, we found that, you know, young people who are experiencing homelessness, many of them do already have relationships with family, but they may need some support. Over 3/4 want improved relationships with family. So that's young people's voice. So we need to take account of this in designing approaches to dealing with youth homelessness. So strengthening these connections and supporting relational interdependence can help youth develop, strong relationships in different environments that will be helpful as they go forward in their life. And so the case management and service provision covers a bunch of things. Family natural supports doesn't just mean family reunification, by the way. That's not always the goal or what the young person wants, but it can be that. It can mean helping young people who are now parents on how to parent, can focus on mental health and addictions. All of these things are important, but a huge part of it is enhancing social and emotional learning so that young people develop the communication skills, the impulse control, anger management. All of these kind of things are part of the work. And so we've been doing 2 rounds of demonstration projects in Canada. So that's where we pilot and test out and do research on it. And I think in all, Ahmad, I'm going to ask you to confirm, is it like, I think about 15 different places between the two studies? Almost, okay, 15-ish. That's very scientific. Okay. So anyway, we did them, most recently with a Public Health Agency of Canada funding. And so we did research on this. And so we did this particular approach to research where you have a baseline survey, and then at the end of their work with the family and natural supports, you do another survey and see what changed and what mattered. We did, so they do surveys, but they also do interviews. And this includes young people and the family and adult members are surveyed. And we did focus groups as well. So these produce very different kinds of knowledge and are important. So I'll just give you some quick highlights of what we've learned here. The improved bonds between family members, there was a slight increase, but that's, one that shows up in the quantitative research, but the qualitative picks up more, like where people can talk about what's happened, what's changed in the family. I think some of the things, the improvements around mental health, communication skills, conflict resolution skills, these were all enhanced by this work. These are things that are portable, that the young person can take with them for the rest of their life. Okay, so other findings is that young people, like overwhelmingly, talked about how important the support was to them, right? So they recognized that there was a value in this. And caseworkers as well were able to talk about the work, and we've learned a lot that helps contribute to the continuous quality improvement of the work. So we've done developmental evaluation, and there we are. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to sing a song.
2 minutes.
2. No, I'm not going to sing. I don't want to clear the room. But anyway, we'll have time for questions after. I just want to close by saying one thing. Family natural supports, we've come to believe, is the fundamental intervention when you work with youth. So it can be a program, a standalone program, or you can build it into other program models, like Housing First for Youth, which we did, and we saw through that research like quite significant improvements in family relationships. So every young person who touches the system should be offered support in this way. And that's it for now.
Thanks, Steve. That's amazing. Love to see the actual data that replicates what we heard from young people and families when
Yes, that's
talking
right.
to them and how amazed they were with the program. So thanks so much for shedding light on that. And for staying on time. Okay, this is amazing. You're making my job so easy over here. Okay, Rebecca and Jackie, take it away.
So are these working now?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, hello. Can you hear us all right at the back? Okay, I'm not going to stand. Do not have beautiful PowerPoint slides. I'm having a bit of slide envy over here. Those are really nice. But Jackie, I'm Jackie. Rebecca and I, this is also Jackie. Even I get confused. Rebecca and I are presenting, although this Jackie was also part of this project, but she's talking about something related but separate. So I am going to just give you a kind of high-level overview of the research we've been doing, and then I'm going to give it to Rebecca to talk a little bit about findings, and then back to me to talk a little bit about findings. So we've spent the last year and a half or so interviewing policymakers, practitioners, advocates, and other adults involved in school-based prevention initiatives in other countries, including Wales, Australia, and the US. Each of whom have some overlapping, some different types of approaches to youth homelessness, prevention and intervention, early intervention in schools. So, but our reason for interviewing these folks is to bring that knowledge back to Canada and be able to apply what we're learning from other places that are doing this successfully, bring it back to Canada to be able to advise, create the research, the policy recommendations, the advocacy that is needed to help push ahead the agenda of engaging schools in youth homelessness prevention, because it can make a huge difference. So Rebecca's going to talk a little bit about our findings. First of all, we did a policy scan of Canadian educational policies. So Rebecca's going to talk a bit about that, as well as some of our preliminary findings from Wales. And then I'm going to take the mic again and talk about what we've learned from Australia and the US, and we're going to talk about the lessons learned that we can bring back to Canada.
Thanks, Jackie. All right, so the policy scan provided a preliminary pulse on the state of policies as well as legislation that pertain to education and youth homelessness prevention in Canada. So we looked at provincial and territorial education laws, and for policies at local policies and at local levels. And when I say local levels, I don't mean separate municipalities, but what we did was a sampling of 2 school districts or 2 school boards in each jurisdiction. So we must acknowledge that since we looked at the 2 school boards per province or jurisdiction, there may be school boards that have policies that aren't represented in our findings. So what we found in terms of legislation, the policy scan on the legislation front, was that we found a couple of provincial policy pieces. One was territorial, one was provincial, that presumably at one point provided some financial assistance for youth experiencing homelessness. However, those are no longer in effect, so currently there are none that are directly linked with youth homelessness and schools. And then we looked at school board policies, as I said, 2 per jurisdiction, and we found a number of policies that address intersectional issues that relate to youth experiences of youth homelessness, but we didn't find explicit policies that explicitly name youth homelessness or deal with youth homelessness. And with these intersectional, with these policies that deal with the issues intersectionally, we found a lot of policies attempting to help youth experiencing marginalization of a number of different types of marginalization. But we also found that some of the policies served managerial purposes more than they serve the interests of the youth. And so an example would be attendance policies are punitive, and they're especially harsh and punitive for youth experiencing homelessness. So now if I turn to, I forgot to turn on my timer, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research with the Wales participants. They have been the last ones interviewed in this study, and so the data for Welsh participants are still being analyzed. However, we can give you a high-level overview. And so Wales is an interesting case study because it has legislation in place. I can't pronounce the title of the legislation, but essentially it places...
Because it's in Welsh.
It's in Welsh, and I do speak a couple of languages, but Welsh is not one of them. But anyway, it places the onus on the government to provide housing assistance to people who are in need of that assistance. And so it is a great first step, and it is working with some degree of effectiveness. There is greater need than there is capacity, so that would be one limitation of this. But it is, the other nice thing about legislation is it enables programs, policies to be developed as well as programs to be unrolled. So the upstream program is being used in Wales. And so what we found was that unhoused youth in Wales have access to mechanisms for housing assistance, and a later phase of our study, which involved interviews with youth with interviews and focus groups with youth with lived experience, revealed that the youth do avail themselves of the programs, and they really appreciate the programs very, very much. They also have friends who are unhoused who have not had access to the programs, either a lack of knowledge of the program's existence, or the programs aren't available in, say, rural areas in Wales. And so there are limitations and there are caveats to this, but we did view the Wales landscape as being a promising area to be looking at for how can we put forth or how can we advocate here in Canada for legislation that can address youth homelessness prevention. And comparing, shall I talk about the comparison of Wales to Canada right now, or? Okay, just quickly. So thinking about the Wales case and Canada, we see some opportunities here in Canada, despite the legislation's slightly sluggish reality or the mismatch of capacity to need. Wales does outperform Canada in a few ways. First of all, it has legislation that enables and leads to program development. And second, the ratio of government housing in Wales is about 6 times that of Canada. So, and that is at or after it having been reduced due to prior government cutbacks on housing. So even with the cutbacks, there's still 6 times more government housing for youth than in Canada. So it means that there is a greater capacity to respond, and these 2 examples just illustrate ways in which Canada can and should respond on youth homelessness challenges. And I'll pass it back to Jackie for the other countries.
2 minutes. All right, 1 minute for Australia, 1 minute for the US. So Australia is the country that birthed the Upstream Initiative. Some people in this room know what Upstream is. It's a school-based survey that identifies youth at risk of homelessness and then connects them using a natural family and natural supports model to help them have the services that supports them and their families. So key learnings for Canada, we are trying to implement Upstream in Canada, and I think other Jackie's going to touch on this. Upstream seems to work best, what they're learning in Australia, when it is driven from the community and the schools. And the people who founded Upstream, David McKenzie and his later associate Tammy Hand, call this the COS model, the community of schools and supports model. It cannot be driven from above, from policy. It cannot be driven by researchers as much as we might like to. It has to come from the bottom. But it is a research established and proven approach. There's now been a whole bunch of research that shows how well it works, both in Australia, now in Canada, also in Wales. I think Scotland's building it, Belgium, all sorts of places it's happening. So another thing we've noticed, and I don't know why necessarily, but it's something to keep in mind, is that the most successful models of Upstream so far seem to be happening in smaller communities. This doesn't mean it can only happen in smaller communities, but I think it's telling about capacity because, and this is conjecture, smaller communities, I think, I was able to interview people in Albury, they have just less things coming at them. And so the community organization can take this on without having to build a whole bunch more capacity. There are fewer schools. There are fewer youth who are in need, just population-wise. And so, but that doesn't mean it can't happen in a larger community. I think it's just something we need to keep in mind about capacity and having the people in place and the infrastructure in place to support it properly. US. Was that 1 minute? So we focused on the US because of their McKinney-Vento legislation. I don't know if folks in the room are familiar with this, but McKinney-Vento has been in place since the late 1980s. This is national legislation. It was substantially revised and updated in the early 2000s. McKinney-Vento requires that schools across the US, every single state, has some sorts of supports in place to ensure that young people and children, if they become homeless, are able to stay at their source school. Even if they're moved across the city or at shelters, whatever, that they have some way, basically it's a right to keep attending their same school to try and reduce disruption. So this is not designed as a youth homelessness prevention program, but it is often being used in that way. There's a great deal of variability across the different states in the US, but every single school is obligated to have what's called a McKinney-Vento liaison. It's often a teacher or a school counselor. So there are various implications for this, and it's done, poorer and better in different parts of the US, and there's some exemplary models which we can really learn from. But I think some of the lessons from Canada include, and Rebecca gave you the policy scan about the complete dearth of youth homelessness policy or even awareness in Canadian schools. McKinney-Vento means that at least one person in every single school in the US is aware of youth homelessness, and often a lot more. It brings the fact of youth homelessness as a reality into the schools, which in Canada we're really lacking, where schools don't feel as if it's their job necessarily. I'm not critiquing schools. Schools have way too much on their plates, but part of the issue and what we've learned from talking to young people is schools and school staff just don't know how to support youth. They don't know how to recognize if a young person's homeless. They don't know how to refer them onto services and supports. They don't even know what homelessness is, neither do the young person themselves, right? Because we all know, there's this idea of homelessness as just being street involved, and youth we know are showing up as in the hidden homeless, couch surfing, or even in shelter. They may not think of themselves as homeless because they have a roof. So Canada, we need to raise awareness. Something like McKinney-Vento, it could be helpful, and I think the other lesson there is that federal, national legislation can be used to help bring schools into the picture. And anyone who's touched schools understands there's a provincial federal tension, but so there is in the US, because schooling education is a provincial mandate. Same in the US, it's a state mandate, but still there's federal legislation that touches on schools and obliges them to have, and provides resources, some, for them to respond. So I think that's it.
I think we're out of time. Good. Yeah. Thank you, Jackie and Rebecca, for providing that system level view on youth prevention. Slightly disheartening that the Canadian context is not doing well, but hopeful that there's other folks we can look to and be inspired and encouraged by. I'm sure that's why we're all at the conference, is to learn from one another. So there's another side to that. So yeah. Jackie, dear colleague, take it away. Yes.
So today I'm
Jackie
discussing
S.
Jackie S. I'm the other Jackie. I'm discussing two projects today, and they're both interrelated with Steve's work and Jackie and Rebecca's. I've had the pleasure of working with every presenter on this panel. So the first one is a 2-year SSHRC-funded study. SSHRC is the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada. It stemmed from my interest in finding out how did these innovative approaches to addressing youth homelessness through prevention move forward in Kelowna. Kelowna has implemented Housing First for Youth and Upstream, as you've heard a little bit about here. And the role of research in relation to the political and policy environment there, if there is a role of research. And the second one is a project just described by my colleagues here, where I led the youth fieldwork. So we wanted to understand from the youth perspectives. So these policies are great and they look beautiful on paper, but what are the actual experiences on the ground, which is super important. And so they seem like distinct projects, but they're absolutely connected. The second one illuminates the challenges and opportunities of youth homelessness prevention. And the first one examines how community ecosystems can mobilize to drive innovations forward. So in oversimplified terms, the problem and solutions, potential solutions. So key takeaways from both essentially there's an ecosystem of people who are all critical to advancing the work of prevention. So obviously people with lived experience who provide the invaluable insights into the experiences, needs, and strengths. Leaders and frontline staff across sectors, including education, who are open to innovation and collaboration, community members, and even researchers, believe it or not. We heard from practitioners and sector leaders that research is indeed valuable in leading to solutions. So it has a role in shifting the minds and hearts towards innovations and offering solutions beyond the traditional and conventional practices and ways of doing things, including family and natural supports. And accessible and impactful research communication can really help mobilize people through the conceptual shifts that are required and aligning priorities of different sectors. It has an important role in illuminating the whys and the how-tos of addressing youth homelessness through innovative prevention-focused approaches. A key and consistent message from youth across contexts is that despite these policies and legislation being in place, so in Wales and even the McKinney-Vento, and we know that there's large variation across contexts in the way that communities implement and understand the way to operationalize these laws and policies. But there are enormous gaps in their experience within systems. So there are issues of access and equity. Despite policies being in place, the youth participants didn't even know that resources were available to them, let alone being able to access them. Huge wait lists. So it's also a systemic problem. A focus group in Wales actually informed us that they were handed tents when they tried to seek help from authorities, despite the legislation being in place. And there are wide variances and inconsistencies across jurisdictions, as some do seem to do much better than others. Equity was an issue as they spoke about stigma and eligibility issues. So the eligibility barriers in the United States are related to inconsistent definitions of homelessness. So the McKinney-Vento Act includes a wide spectrum of youth in different circumstances, whereas the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, they don't include a lot of these. So even though youth were technically required under, or eligible under McKinney-Vento to access supports, the HUD, so the Housing and Urban Development Ministry, wouldn't provide the resources. So there's a huge disconnect. Okay, one more minute. What can we do about these issues? So bridging the gap between policies and what happens on the ground requires youth-focused, trauma-informed, wraparound supports. And the youth voice obviously is very critical to pathways because we have to understand what's happening on the ground, not just aspiring to this gold standard of policies. So an example of an initiative in Canada that is doing it well and addressing a lot of these gaps is Upstream Canada. So you've heard about it. It's a social innovation that focuses on youth homelessness prevention through early intervention and cross-sector collaboration, so between education and community-based social services supports. And I'm proud to say that I work in this ecosystem of great people who work collaboratively, including youth with lived experience who advised us in developing the model, educators, social workers, people and partner organizations. So essentially provides universal access through privacy-protected screening for 12 to 14-year-old students, and it connects people to coordinated care. Another oversimplification based on limited time, but I'm happy to connect with anyone who'd like to learn more about Upstream. And I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Jackie. The journey watching, I've been lucky to watch Jackie when she started at the COH with Upstream, and the journey watching it evolve has been so incredible. So it's very powerful. So we still have a lot in our program to do. We have a lovely interview kind of style talk showy panel, if we will. So we've got 3-4 questions. We'll see how we do with time. I'm lost on time because we started late. I think we can go to like 11:45. Okay. We're just making stuff up here as we go. So I'm going to share the questions with our panelists, and then maybe we can kind of start this way. Jackie S., maybe you can start off and we can go down. And let's get into things. So thanks for providing us amazing, just like snippets overview of all the work that you're doing and what you've been up to. And so as we know, oh, that's not our session title, but as we know from the session title, the conversation is about successful youth homelessness prevention programs, which I'm sure a lot of folks here are really interested in. I'm sure a lot of folks are here, you're interested in youth stuff or prevention stuff, but sometimes it's hard to know where to start and what works and what you should kind of be focusing and spending your time and important time and resources on. So with that, how have you defined success? A bit of a loaded word, success, but can you tell us how your projects are truly sort of successfully advancing youth homelessness prevention? Do you want to start us off?
Sure. That's a big question, and I think with prevention, it's always a very difficult thing because we don't necessarily have the aggregated data and the outcomes that funders want to see. So then we've had to evolve this definition of success to looking at with Upstream, at least I can speak to Upstream Canada, looking at are young people confident and equipped with the tools that they need to seek support moving forward. That's one definition of success. Another one is, are the staff, so are the case managers burnt out? Do they feel purpose in what they're doing? And so we've seen really positive markers of success in that way, and redefining, we can't prove that preventative intervention is going to prevent absolutely young people from becoming homeless, but we can look at outside indicators of success and get creative in that way. I hope that's it for now for me.
Thanks.
So I'm trying to think of what angle to come at this question. So it's a really good one. I've been working in this domain of kind of school-based responses to youth who are experiencing homelessness for over a decade. And it emerged, I actually have a PhD in education, but did not intend to kind of find my way back into schools. I'm a sociology professor now. I was working on youth homelessness and urban gentrification and stuff. But for young people who I was interviewing, and I've interviewed, 500 plus youth now over the course of my career in Canada and in various countries elsewhere, schools keep coming up, right? School is one of the places that all young people pretty much universally touch. It's still a publicly funded system as much as it's endured cuts as all publicly funded systems have. And so schools are really important. So I guess what I'm saying is I've been working on the issue for a while, and I think Steve can relate in this kind of sense of it's a long, slow-burning process of trying to gather evidence and do the advocacy and bring people together as much as we're capable of doing from academia. And so, I think in terms of a research success, the fact that Upstream is starting to take root in Canada, and we are having conversations about trying to get one happening in Ottawa, and that was an initiative that we tried to get off the ground 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, didn't happen, trying again, that would be, to me, that would feel like a major success to see that happen and to see it happening elsewhere. But I think another way of understanding success, and again, especially the frontline workers, the folks who are working in community will be able to relate to this, is just and I'm repeating a story I've told several times because it's been sitting with me. I was able to do a couple of our interviews with young people for this same project in Australia in September because I was there. And I connected with 2 young people who had passed through the very talkative Mike, who had passed through the Albury project, which is one of the successful Upstream models in Australia, and I interviewed them about their experiences going through. And just, as Jackie pointed out, there's disconnect often between policy and legislation and youth experiences, but for these 2 young people, their experience of becoming homeless and then getting connected to services and then getting back on track, it happened within a few months. It was seamless for them. And listening to them narrate that process of they became 2 different young men who may or may not know each other, but the Albury project, what we call the Upstream project, was in their school. They were able to get connected. I don't think they were even identified through the survey. It's just that Albury had been around and they knew where the office was, so they understood where they could go to get help, or they heard from a friend. So they went to the Albury project office in their school, got support, got rehoused. One of the young men was reconnected with his mother, was able to move home. And it just was so easy in like the best possible way for a young person who's experienced homelessness. And contrast this with the stories that I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with of, a young person who becomes homeless and then tries to access support and that system fails, and then tries to access support and that system fails, and then ends up in the adult shelter and gets robbed or sexually assaulted, and then that system fails, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. Until they are, so traumatized and have turned to addiction just to survive, and get entrenched, and then end up in a life that leads to adult homelessness and entrenched poverty. It just doesn't have to be that way. It does not have to be that way, and it makes me really angry, as I'm sure it does many of you in this room, that so many young people and adults are they're not falling through the cracks, they're being thrown into the cracks, and it just doesn't have to be that way. So success is those stories of young people who just were able to get right back up on their feet again because of this simple but incredibly effective program. So hopefully we can keep it going in Canada.
Thanks, Jackie. It is indeed a great question, and it's such a complicated question to answer. A simple answer might be that success is when you can see tangible prevention happening, but leading to that tangible prevention is a very complicated and multifaceted road, and so honing in on the research piece and the policy and practice piece, what we have seen, we could criticize the policies very easily for their shortcomings, but looking at it from the other side, like for example, listening to what Jackie Kay had just explained about these youth in Australia, is that policy can be a point of departure that can enable practices and can strengthen programs and set the stage for the rationale for the programs and help strengthen the programs when they're rolled out. And policies that are intersectional to experiences of youth homelessness, that's okay. We need those as well, but we also need we need to clearly articulate and bring into the lexicon that definition of youth homelessness, and so that definition can be engaged and understood and acted upon. And so I think a success would be to have the policy actors in Canada responding to this research with some commitment to let's get a starting point. Yes, it will be messy and it will be imperfect, but that will be a starting point. And I think that starting point would be a marker of success.
I like this microphone better than yours. So there are three ways to think about success, I think. One is at the level of young people and their families, that their connection to families improves, that both parents, siblings, and young people develop the skills to ensure that the relationships are stronger, that young people have more meaningful adults in their life, and that's one of the outcomes we saw in our research as well, and that their risk of becoming homelessness declines, right? So that's what we want. We want young people to not have to experience homelessness. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we will not get there until there are in place interventions to support young people. And we're learning a lot more in Canada about how to do that work. I think we actually know a lot about how to do it. But we need to have funders, policymakers line up behind it. And that's a slower piece of work because we're in the homelessness crisis now, and so we're drawn to emergency supports. We need at that level, permission giving, if not directives, to have communities implement good programs. And then finally, we need a systems response to homelessness. So public systems have to be brought in on the homelessness issue. If you take a human-centered design approach to helping young people, you'll find that if you ask young people, right, like when you were at risk of homelessness or experienced it, who did you engage? Who did you talk to? They don't say, you know, I went down to City Hall and I asked, where can I get family mediation support? They don't go to homeless shelters generally. And we have to remember that 40% of all currently homeless youth had their first experience before they were 16, where there's no infrastructure at all. And so who do they talk to? They might tell their friends. They might tell their friends' parents. They might tell their teacher or counselor. They might tell a doctor or a nurse, right? They might tell a coach. So the thing is, that human-centered design piece shows that young people are already connected to a whole range of public systems. And those systems, so far in Canada, and without legislation, I can't see this changing anytime soon, are not mandated or supported to help young people. We know that, exiting child protection is a pipeline to homelessness, but there's no obligation or duty on the part of of that system to make sure young people don't exit into homelessness. Schools should be at the table because, every young person who experiences homelessness was in school once, and often there's an adult in their life who knew what to do. And the schools can do it, but again, that's going to take legislation. I teach a graduate, I'll just finish with this last piece. I teach a graduate course every year on youth homelessness. And the students are all practicing teachers. They're teachers, and so they want to learn about this. And so the whole course then gets structured around, have you ever had a student that you knew or suspected was homeless? And they'll be like, almost all of them will say, yes, there's this kid who was sleeping out behind the school. And what happens at the practical level, and it's sometimes supported by board policy, is the teachers will tell the principal, Johnny is experiencing homelessness or is having these troubles. They get told time and again, don't do anything. And one school board has its kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy. Don't do anything. They're risk-averse institutions. They're not called upon, and it shouldn't be the teacher's job to fix everything. Yeah. But if you take that cost model, schools could do a much better job. And so, anybody here a teacher? No, okay. Anybody here know a teacher? Do you know a teacher? You should ask them what it's like and what would be helpful. Because you'll be surprised at the experiences of teachers who don't feel supported at all in doing any of this. So anyway, there we go.
Great, thank you. Amazing first answers to the question, and I love that we started off with centering the voice of the young people and what they had to say, but then also kicking some ass with busting policies and systems and doing things in a much more, I think, thoughtful and meaningful and intentional way than perhaps is currently happening, and grounding both that bottom-up and top-down level approach. So, okay, moving along, and just, again, sorry guys, being mindful of time because we have 2 more questions, plus our lovely Q&A. So, okay, so the next question is, and we're shifting a little from our program, guys, a little bit, just because we can. So in our planning meeting, we are planning for the panel, we had spoken about how all of your projects teach us that youth homelessness prevention, and I think you've kind of segued into this a little bit, requires a bit of a paradigm shift in lots of different ways, and that things need to be bigger than one person or system. Promise, I think you started off by telling us that. So could you tell us a little bit about what it took to overcome sort of this barrier in your project of addressing this paradigm shift that it really takes? And Jackie, yes, do you want to start us off again? Yeah, do you want to use your mic?
Yeah, sure. I can speak from the perspective of leading Upstream Canada. So this initiative obviously requires collaboration with the education sector, and there's all kinds of challenges with that. So first of all, homelessness is not considered a responsibility within the scope of practice for educators, and understandably so. So that was number one hurdle. And I can speak to that specifically. So it required paradigm shifts from educators, district people to embrace that as something that they want to address. I think many of them do recognize that it's a problem. So even in a community like Kelowna, they have been recognizing youth homelessness for a long time in the education system as a big problem, but they didn't know what to do about it. So, you know, my background is political science and policy science, so I drew from my field to try to see how can we reframe. Instead of trying to convince education that they should care and do something about youth homelessness, how can we reframe so that educators understand that, you know, the priorities are actually aligned? So this is an equity problem. And these young people are, you know, experiencing unstable home lives, housing insecurity, family relationship breakdown. So these are all things that the school system wants to address anyway, well-being and equity. And so it's really about reframing and helping educators to understand. And especially because Upstream is an earlier intervention, homelessness is not necessarily on the radar when it comes to 12-year-olds, right? And, you know, there's fear of parents getting upset about, you know, potentially being implicated while your child is at risk of homelessness, right? So a lot of reframing and just aligning priorities. I think that's what really, really helped to drive this forward, to say, well, this isn't another program that's going to add to your responsibilities in the school. It's actually going to alleviate your social care burdens. And so that was a huge sell for a lot of teachers.
Yeah, I think you asked what paradigm shift was needed to engage in this work. I feel like we're more asking for a paradigm shift, right? Or maybe demanding, requiring, expecting a paradigm shift. And it does have to do with the relationship between schools and youth homelessness, certainly in the research that I've been engaged in. And also the relationship between schools and research in Canada, which it doesn't have to be the way it is. And I have to say, you know, and like in the US, for instance, it's much easier for researchers to be able to do research in schools. And in Canada, that for whatever reason, that culture is very different. And so we tried to get in to talk to teachers. And Steve knows this. Kevin was the one doing it. You know, we went through the ethics, the Carleton ethics, the school board's ethics, at Niagara school board ethics, and were declined. Well, Carleton let us through, but the school boards didn't. And each time I'd reach out and say, can we talk? Like, let me just, I want to understand what's going on, and you know, and I get responses back and say, well, have you looked at the work that Steve Gaetz is doing at Upstream? And I'm like, yeah, I know about Upstream. I'm in the same project. Oh my goodness. So I get, like, schools are overwhelmed, and I get why they're trying to protect their students and staff from research to a certain extent. But, you know, we were asking to talk to teachers on their own time with their permission, where, you know, to find out exactly this question of how do teachers encounter young people who are homeless and how do they respond, so we can have some evidence to explain what's happening in schools. So, you know, I think that's a piece of the paradigm shift. You know, schools are publicly funded institutions, and then there are public duties that are attached to that. And again, I'm not beating up on schools. Schools are so important, and they're one of our last universal public funded institution, right? Like in terms of actual universal access. So we need to protect that and build it up. But I also think there is room for the kind of Canadian education culture to look at other places, including the U.S. You know, I mean, Canada, we like to pump ourselves up as better than the U.S. all the time. And again, I'm sure people in this room know that that's not necessarily true. but like US schools have been recognizing the fact of youth homelessness and at least trying to respond to it since the 80s. So, you know, we could be doing better in Canada in terms of recognizing that youth homelessness is happening, that students are experiencing it, and it might not be the primary responsibility of schools to end homelessness, of course not, but to let in the organizations, the community organizations that can support and to allow researchers to have a certain level of access anyway, so we can find out what's going on and support them to get the kind of services and assistance in place.
Thanks, Jackie. First, I think I just want to acknowledge my 20 years as a school teacher where I was not doing any youth homelessness prevention work at the time. I wasn't a researcher at the time, but during those 20 years, I spent a few years working at alternative schools, and we had a lot of students couch surfing, and we had a lot of directives not to send the food from the food bank home with the kids. We're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed, we're not allowed to, these are the rules on the taxi chits. These are the rules. So a lot of, stand back, stand away, just get them their credits and get them re-engaged in school, but stand back and stand away. And I believe very strongly that getting policy and legislation articulated will help, because my anecdotal experience from teaching is that stand back and stand away was a liability response, and we don't want liability, and we don't want you putting the school in a liable position, so you need to stand back. But if we had legislation and policy that would require us to address what we are seeing with our students. Coming back to the research now, I think there's two things. With this study, I was struck by the lack of cohesion and lack of understanding on a definition of what it means, what youth homelessness means in the first place. And I think being all of my research thus far has been in comparative and international contexts. And I think there's a lot to be said for comparative and international research, and we can learn a lot from engaging in conversations with people who have different setups and who are doing things differently. But a common definition would really serve us greatly to be able to first understand what it is we're talking about so that we're not comparing apples and oranges. So that's the number one. And then the second thing, I think, for the paradigm shift is that and I'm new in this for youth homelessness prevention research. I've only been working in this research for 2 years, so I'm new. But what I am perceiving is an overemphasis on the crisis management. And so the paradigm shift that I see as very important is to shift from, crisis management will always be there, but to profile quite intentionally and strongly the prevention piece.
Here.
So how to make a paradigm shift is an interesting topic on its own. I think there's several elements that are helpful. There's not a recipe for how to do it, but there are things that are helpful. So one is, do we have an evidence base for prevention? It's a curious thing, but people, in the world of homelessness, most of what gets done does not have a research evidence base, right? But people will throw that up as a reason to not do prevention.
Yeah.
Where's the evidence for prevention? It's like, oh, now you care about evidence. Yeah. So that's one. The second thing is the practice knowledge. Mm-hmm. The people who are doing the work, their knowledge is super important to getting this work done. And we have to recognize that and amplify it and support it. So we need people doing prevention and learning about prevention, because we can talk about it, but at the end of the day, if you're working in an organization, you probably want to talk to somebody who's actually done this, right? To learn from them. So that's important. We need to figure out how to take things to scale, how to scale up things. We're not very good at that. After all these years of housing first, It's still not in every community, and where it exists, often there is no fidelity to the program model, right? So we don't do a good job in it. Now, before we beat ourselves up on it, there's something, a kind of research called implementation science, which looks at that question. If you create something new, an innovation, how do you get it so that it's common in the community, right? And the research on implementation science, a lot of it comes from healthcare, right? So people will develop a new procedure or have a new gadget, tricorder. That's dating me. But, you know, but it takes, on average, 17 years from the time that the evidence base is solid on a practice, takes 17 years before it becomes a standard practice in the field. Right? So this isn't just about the homelessness sector, right? The reality is people like doing what they already know. And so innovation can be problematic. And so the final piece then is that leadership by government and funders on the issue. We've come a long way in the last 5 years, right? The United States, about a month ago, released its national homelessness prevention strategy. Reaching home, I would say this doesn't happen at the provincial and territorial level so much. And we have some weird things like in Ontario, the provincial homelessness funding stream is called the Homelessness Prevention Program. Yeah. It doesn't actually have anything to do with prevention. But anyway, Reaching Home has moved in that direction. So communities are required to demonstrate reductions in inflows into homelessness and returns to homelessness. The directives, which are the government's, which clarify what are the government's priorities around homelessness and what is eligible for funding, they have been reworked, including the glossary, in the past year. And now, if you go and look at them, they talk about upstream. In the directives, they talk about family and natural supports. They talk about Housing First for Youth. So these are now things that the government has said, we can stand behind these, and that's a start, right? But without additional funding, without a commitment, it's hard for communities to just start new things because there's an opportunity cost. Like, what are you going to stop doing so you can fund the prevention? So there needs to be more direct investment, more support, training and technical assistance, these kind of things. Then we'll get there. And the implementation science piece tells us, and this is hard, but we have to be patient.
Yeah.
And I think up on this panel, there's a lot of people, myself included, who are very impatient. Like, let's get there. So.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. And I feel that because I think back to a decade and a half ago when I was in this work, and just even the word prevention wasn't really a thing. And it is now, obviously. I kind of see it everywhere, but it feels like there's still so much work to do. So, and also, you know, I think one of the things I've learned and just echoed up here is just how you can't just plonk in a program like FNS or plonk in a policy and then, oh, we're good job, you know, off we go. There's so much more work around it to make it actually land well and be a sustained thing. So I'm going to put us to our last question. Skip us to our last question just for the sake of time. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, folks. So hoping we have some good questions and conversation continuing. So, and this is like our take home question for folks. So sure that people in the audience are excited about this work and maybe want to do it in their own communities or figure out ways to continue to advance kind of the work that's happening, whether it's something like upstream or policy or FNS, what have you. And we talked about, you know, people might want to be a part of scaling things up. So if we think about how your work, your projects might tie to sort of the broader social systems, what do you feel is needed to make this work? Or, you know, what advice would you give to folks that are listening that might want to take this back to their communities and try something or do something? A piece of advice or guidance or insight would be most welcome. Do you want to start us off?
Another big question, but I can hone in on certain things. So definitely from a funder's perspective and just everybody's perspective, understanding that planning takes time. And to set it up for success, we don't want to rush into implementation, and I'm talking about Upstream Canada. But unfortunately, I know that a lot of funding structures require quick implementation. But we know that ultimately, if we rush into implementation, things are going to go wrong. It's going to get messy. So it does take time to set Upstream up for success, but once you take that time, things go really smoothly, and you're really setting it up for success. So, and meaningful collaboration, not just saying, well, let's use the school as a physical, structure where we can roll this out, and transplanting it into the school, but truly collaborating and honoring educators as experts in their own right as well. I think that really builds in that sustainability piece. So I'll leave it there.
Echoing what other Jackie said, first Jackie, I'm second Jackie.
Jackie K.
I'm Jackie K. I'm Jackie the Unicorn. There we go. Unicorn Jackie versus Angel Jackie. One of the in our comparative research, I was in Australia last summer as well as this fall, and last summer I was able to visit the Albury project, which is the super successful one, and then I was also able to talk to one of the people in government. So Albury is part of New South Wales, the state of New South Wales. Geelong project, which is the original one, is in the state of Victoria. In the state of Victoria, they managed to go for quite a long time, the Geelong project, but they had funding, and they eventually got government funding, which was fantastic, but it was from the Department of Education. And ultimately, they found that their kind of interests and goals were not aligned, and it became really complicated and difficult to work with the Department of Education because there was like overlapping goals, but not the paradigms and the sort of sense of outcomes, et cetera, were different. In New South Wales, they were able to get funding, government funding again, from the ministry that is addressing housing and homelessness. And they have an MOU with the Department of Education, so the Department of Education's at the table, but the funding and the sort of primary contact is with the Ministry of, I don't know what it's called, it was some like communities, families, youth, but it's addressing housing and homelessness. And so I was able to sit down with the policymaker there, and she told me about the failed effort to implement Upstream in New South Wales, which was in Sydney. Albury is the success story. Sydney, this particular community in Sydney was the failure, and they're trying again. And the reason it failed, and this is echoing what Angel Jackie said, is that and similar things we've already said is that, they had the funding, the government was funding it, they had a community organization, but they had to kind of drag the school along kicking and screaming. And it was a bit of a top-down approach, and it wasn't like they managed to make it happen, and by the end the school started to see the value, and so there was a sort of like, oh, actually maybe this is something that we should do, but ultimately it kind of fell apart, and they were going to try and resuscitate it. So just kind of reiterating that the need for it to come from the ground up, and it sounds like there aren't any teachers in the room necessarily, maybe former teachers. We need the school boards to be part of this conversation, to have the buy-in, and we need the community organizations as well. And that, so, for those who are interested in taking on these models, also to know that we are developing an evidence base, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Like you can go to the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, the Homeless Hub website, and get the reports on Upstream Canada and the Australian Upstream model. You could email us, and we'll share resources. The Kelowna project evaluation, parts of it are already out, I think, and then more is coming out. So, you don't have to do it alone, and also, don't have to reinvent the wheel. That these things happen, but it does have to be driven. At least this Upstream model does need to have the community of schools and supports. The community is the schools and the support community organizations that are there driving it. But we will help. Please let us help. We want to help.
That's great, Jackie, thanks. And thank you, Angel Jackie. Just to echo what Angel Jackie said about the potential messiness of policy work and the importance of planning and time, that really resonated with me, as well as educators are experts and they do understand their kids. So they need to be at the table. And then echoing what Unicorn Jackie said as well. So I think, you know, my advice is let's work together, let's talk. Do avail yourselves of the resources that are available. As a former teacher, I do not believe in reinventing the wheel, even though I've done it a million times, and it's a waste of energy and time. So let's talk and communicate. And I think just to share, I think the opening line that the first graduate course in policy that I took, I believe the first sentence that the professor said was, "The majority of public policy fails." And that is so crushing to hear that reality. But then when we unpacked it, you know, a lack of proper consultation and stakeholder engagement, and where are the voices of the youth with lived experience, and so how to intentionally set up that communication and the planning and the work so that when that policy comes out, we can expect hiccups. They will be there. That doesn't mean abandon it. It means that we need to tweak it and keep on working together. It's very simple.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things. And so just to put it simply, there's a lot of ways you can engage and learn more if you're interested in these things. You talked about resources, which is important, but Way Home Canada does training and technical assistance on a whole range of preventive interventions. And the training and technical assistance is amazing. So the training might be like you have a day or 2 days or 3 days where you learn about the intervention. The technical assistance is to help you get when you're at the implementation stage. Because learning is one thing, and then you get back and it's like, oh my God, never thought of how to do this. So that's important. You can engage organizations that are in that space of innovation. You know, everybody wants to help everyone else, right? So, but when I look in this room, there are organizations, Don LaRue, Covenant House, you know, that are in that space of innovation, doing like really important things. That's where you'll start to get at, like, how do we do this? Like, how do we move from not doing this to doing it? And so that's important. And then one last thing, communities of practice. There are communities of practice built around these things that are helpful, right? So people can learn from other practitioners. And I said that was the last thing, but I'm lying. So I have one. The other thing is, everybody here knows the Reaching Home and how it funds through community entities. I think community entities, if I can generalize, often do not prioritize youth homelessness sufficiently, and often do not prioritize prevention. So a lot of the work, if you want to move the sector forward, that means engaging with, and I won't even pretend to know how to do that well, but that's where the work has to, because they're gatekeepers, right? And they have funding that could be directed at supporting youth. Got to keep the message, you know, the youth need to be a priority. You know, we know that, you know, 50% of all people experiencing homelessness had their first experience before they were 25. Like, if we can help young people and their families, we'll have better outcomes for young people and their families. We'll have better outcomes for the community, and we'll have better outcomes in terms of reducing chronic homelessness, which is a priority. Because that chronicity for many starts when you're a teenager. And that's a shame. It's an outrage, actually, that we let things get that far. So there are things that we can do that are out there. There's lots of good knowledge. There's lots of good knowledge in this room. We just need to tap it, find out.
Great, thank you. That's a great way to wrap up our interview portion of the panel. So maybe we can do a round of applause for our panelists. Amazing conversation. Lots of ideas shared. I hope you're all feeling sort of encouraged, inspired, intrigued, perhaps. So let's open it up to the Q&A. I think we can do like, I know we're kind of technically in the lunch, but we started late, so we're going to take that time back. We'll hang back for about 15 minutes, and then I'm sure folks can come up and chat if you want more time. And if you have a question, throw your hand up, and then I'll bring the mic to you. And I think I get to pick who gets the hardest question. So that's what I was told. So we'll start right here. I'll come around this way. And we need to speak into the mic for the virtual audience, so even people with loud voices.
Sounds great. I have two questions, but I'll start with one, and then I'll let other people ask and come back to my second. So the thing about prevention is I can imagine you also don't know what you're preventing. You could be preventing homelessness, but you could also be preventing addictions or other types of adverse challenges. So when I see this quote, for example, I'm seeing that there are counselors who do this work as well. And I would see that a young person, they would go to a counselor and they would talk about mental health issues. They would talk about whether or not they're going to schools. So I'm thinking about how schools who are already engaging with community partners who do this work, with partners and community counselors who perhaps are associated with a particular identity, how would we make a case for FNS if they're already doing this work in some capacity? Is it that this work is additional? Is it unique? Is it different? What is it that would convince a school board or another funding agency that what this is different from the preventative work that's already happening?
My understand, actually, yeah. But my understanding is school counselors have a different role in most cases.
So if I can just add context then, so oftentimes, at least in Ottawa, if a young person has a specific issue, they'll refer them out to a community-based counselor.
Right. Yeah.
So then they'll speak, so it wouldn't be school counselor-based sometimes, it would be somebody who identifies as a racialized person, for example, or a particular identity.
Right. So the thing is that can be true, but if the person's at risk of homelessness, we actually need people in the field, we need infrastructure in the field, in particular around family and natural supports, that one can refer a young person to. Mm-hmm. And that involves, it's a different kind of work. It involves thinking about the client differently. It's not just the young person, but it's a young person and their family. And so you could absolutely structure it in through schools. Mm-hmm. You absolutely do it, but it needs to be a little more deliberate, and I wouldn't presume that schools are actively doing this work.
Yeah.
So,
I think to add to what Steve said, and again reflecting on what I learned in Australia, we need a both and approach, right? Obviously there's a mental health crisis for all of us. I mean, it's been emerging for decades, really, but certainly since the pandemic, there's a lot more awareness of it for young people. So, and there are not enough mental health supports across the board for adults or for young people. So that definitely needs to keep happening. And in Australia, they've identified that now. Even though they have started the upstream, it's still only happening in a few communities, but they're recognizing it as an excellent intervention. But that policymaker I spoke with was like, but we still need more mental health supports. Like that's still a big gap in Australia, right? So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. And as Steve said, the sorts of knowledge and expertise that people connected to an upstream type response, for instance, would bring is not only about mental health or drugs, addiction, but is also about the family mediation, the housing, how to find housing, how to get on OW, how to, all these other sorts of things that organizations like Operation Come Home and Youth Services Bureau here in the city do. So, now I know sometimes that's a hard sell, and we were having this discussion this morning. How do we sell this to schools that are already so tapped out? And I really think that's also about the evidence base, about showing that, in fact, this relieves the social care burden of teachers.
Yes.
And that's what we're finding. It's not actually asking more of schools, it's offering services to schools that is going to help address an issue that is already happening, that teachers know is happening. And we could even argue from the sort of fear of litigation, the whatever that word is, the liability, right? That it remove the liability from the schools, these young people get connected to outside organizations who will then take them on and support them. So, but yeah, it's you know, I know where your question's coming from. It's this conversation we're having here in Ottawa about like how do we get schools to recognize the value of this when they are already just so swamped and overwhelmed and juggling so much.
If I can.
Thanks. As some of you know, I'm currently involved in research, so I spend a lot of time talking with young people who are in housing now but have experienced homelessness and trauma and family stuff. And I guess I've encountered and my background is a little different, lived experience and all sorts of, stuff. I'm struck by this family and natural supports phrase. And one of the things I'm thinking, I'm just realizing, schools are an unnatural support. They're completely artificial. They're not. When I hear natural supports like this, I think, I translate it in part into supports we don't have to pay for. It's basically labor that is not paid for by the government. And also when I'm talking with these young people, their discussions of family, yes, they indicate a lot of family problems as the origins of their housing problems, but also a very complex and perhaps difficult or undeveloped understanding of family, or what a support system is, or what's the difference between family and peer supports, for instance. And I'm just wondering if you can unpack that a little bit. And I'm not sure, just the phrase, I think, is a bit exclusionary for some people who just see the words family, or I've never had natural supports. What does that mean? And family is abuse. So that is kind of exclusionary in that way.
I think that if you're engaging with young people, those are conversations that you would have, that's part of the work. The work may be understanding what happened, right? That's, a therapeutic approach to family natural supports will often go there, help you understand what happened. I think that's the work, right? And so, and young people, when we've talked to young people, and we've done focus groups, that kind of thing, and you ask them, was there a point in your journey where an intervention could have helped? Most people can do that. They can say, yes, when I was in school and my teacher knew, but nothing happened, and I needed that help. And so, the work of building those natural supports, right? So family doesn't necessarily mean the family, your parents that you lived with or caregivers. It's defined by the young person, who the family is, right? And who are the natural supports. And you can help people, and that government would be paying for the intervention, but the sustainability and impact of that intervention rests with the natural supports in the families, right? And so, which isn't necessarily paid for, but that's fine. I had supports that weren't paid for as well, right? And most of us would have. So. Directing.
Hi, you had mentioned that Upstream works best in smaller communities. I'm just wondering if there's been anything done in rural communities or research or anything along those lines?
I think Jackie Kay was talking about the Australian context. In Canada, we're actually working with mid-sized cities, and it seems to be working very well there. So in St. John's right now, they're actually for the first time implementing this in a rural community. So we'll be learning a lot about how that pans out. We'll keep you posted.
I think we have time for one more. Okay. Over here, yeah.
I have two questions, but I'll just keep it to one. Well, maybe I'm opening a can of worms, or maybe it's an easy question. I guess I'm wondering, why do you have to go through the school boards? And why couldn't you, say, go through like teachers' unions or like a parent council? Like parents would probably want to, you know, have an invested interest in what's happening with the children in their schools. So just curious about why that's the limitation there.
You mean for upstream? So, I mean, the school board is the one kind of, they're the authority, right? They're in charge, giving the approvals. But it's a multi-pronged solution, I think, because part of the way to get the districts to approve was to go through the parents. So what our lead community-based organization in Kelowna did was to kind of get in there with the parent advisory council and mobilize knowledge about what upstream is about. So they got the parents on board, actually. So that was quite strategic. And because they mitigated some risk in that way, the board was a lot more amenable to doing it. Yeah.
I think, was there one more hand? Apparently we do have time for one more. Was there like someone who put their hand up who has not asked a question? Now I've just squashed that. There was someone? Oh, okay, second.
People are going to get angry.
Yes.
So my question is around the systems piece. So each of you spoke to how there's multiple layers and levers that are involved from the community level all the way to the government level. So in your experience, how do you see all of those things happening? Do they magically happen together? Do they happen independently? Is there a level of coordination? What is a way or ways to coordinate the system so it works more effectively?
I'll give you one example from the United States, and it's from Washington State. They passed legislation in 2018 that mandated that no young person exiting a public institution should become homeless. And the responsibility is on those public institutions, right? And I thought, oh my God, wouldn't that be helpful? If we did that in Canada, right? But in Canada, generally, around homelessness, we don't use legislation to define policy. It's usually through funding, right? But that's an example, right, that you could do. There's other ways of coming at it, though. And I think that within child protection, certainly in the last 10 years, like 10 years ago, it would have been a difficult conversation to have, like the relationship between homelessness and child involvement in child protection. But I think things have changed quite dramatically. So people in that sector are caring about that and trying to figure it out, and you have different experiments in different places, both at the, child protection services level in Ontario, or in BC, where they have a very bold strategy around supporting young people so that they don't age out into homelessness, and supporting them till they're 27, if people want that, right? So change can happen, and it can be driven from the top. You were saying that, right? Or it can come from the ground up. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think I feel like I'm not the one to speak to this, but that some of the kind of strategic thinking in Canada, Jackie and Steve can tell me if I'm right about this, is to run the programs like the upstream projects, the demonstration projects, the Housing First for Youth, and show efficacy, and then keep working up and out, and that is what happened in Australia with their upstream as well. As it started in small in particular communities, and they got foundation funding, and then they were able to advocate up to government to get the government funding. But
I think it's the way to do it personally, with upstream at least. In the US, for example, in California, there's $14 million allocated to supporting youth experiencing homelessness through schools, but it's so messy the way the system is approaching it. Like, I think 36% of youth actually experiencing homelessness were able to access those resources, and even for those students, an average of $52 per student was allocated. So, you know, we can see that from the top down is not always the way. I think it has to be both, right?
Very last question, and then we're going back to Promise, who's really running the show here.
Thank you for indulging me. Steve, this is probably maybe directed at you. Curious about the family natural supports. In coming to this lens with justice, so criminal justice, youth justice, and thinking through how, also why I'm no stranger to the uphill battle, which is why I asked about circumventing the school board. But I'm wondering about how family and natural supports factors in when you, or if you've considered about, you know, this framework for the natural supports demonstration project, how it can be applied in a youth justice context. Because we've heard it from, I'm part of a group called the National Youth Justice Network as well, and that's something we've heard consistently about trying to like have policy and funding behind restoring those family and natural supports in the youth justice system. So wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, it actually, there are some examples of how that can work. Yeah. There's a organization in the Jane Finch area of Toronto. I can't remember what the organization's called because I never remember names. Whether you're a person or yeah. It could be. That's as close as I'm going to get. But anyway, what they do is they work with young people prior to being discharged from prison. I don't know how they deal with people on remand because it's a very unpredictable when someone's released. But what they do is they say, propose to young people, we have this idea that we could put together a care team or a support team for you of people that you select. And they could, you know, they could help you through mentoring or supports or guidance, this kind of thing. And so young people will say, oh, my grandmother would be great, you know, that kind of thing. Or they might say, I had this teacher in grade 5 who was really awesome. And I don't know if they'd want to do it, but be part of that team, but it would be great. And so then the program goes and contacts people to see if they want to be part of this. And that teacher might be like, oh, I remember Johnny or whatever, right? Generally, people step up. Like, that's the cool thing. It's like you can generate natural supports sometimes just by asking people. And if the young person is in charge of who that group is, I think you have a much better chance of success. So I think that, you know, with the FNS, our thinking about it is that it should be part, and this actually comes from Ontario, from the integrated youth wellness hubs. Like, it should be embedded there. It should be embedded in the justice system. It should be in all of these other public systems, because young people are going to show up in these other public systems, and this could be helpful. So I think, like, in the long run, that's where it would be great to see it, like people experimenting with it in these other contexts. A lot of young people, their first, you know, engagement with telling someone they're homeless is through these integrated youth wellness hubs, right? They have young people come in and they're not equipped to support them. And so, like, getting the training in there and the staff, there is, you know, it's almost endless where you could imagine. But again, start with human-centered design. You know, where are young people engaging public systems? That's where you need to have a pathway to the support.
Great. I think that's a great way to wrap up and handing it back over to Promise. But let's give our panelists another amazing round of applause. They were so amazing. Thank you, everyone.
Bear with me while I get the visual back up here. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, so thanks so much to our panelists for sharing everything that you have. Oop, kind of on the wrong slide there. Thanks so much to our panelists for sharing everything that you have today, and thanks again to the CAH team who's giving me a bit of a stink eye for taking too long, but I'll be quick, I promise, bear with me, I swear. It's been a really inspiring conversation that I think highlights some of the ugliness that comes with change and the fact that it can be a little, difficult at the start, right? Because there's a lot of mess to get through, but we shouldn't shy away from that just because it's hard. That's, I say, would be the big takeaway I've picked up from today's conversation, is that you just have to be okay with being uncomfortable and getting it wrong a couple times, and then several more. But be brave enough to take the first step. But that's important, right? It's important to be good at being wrong and to move past the culture of being like, this is the solution and we're great, when we're really not at a wider societal level. So I thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today. Like I mentioned, this is an extension of a series we've been doing at the COH since the start of the year. So if you did enjoy this conversation, I have some good news for you. As you can see on my slide up here, we actually do have 8 episodes that have been recorded so far. 7 of those are currently available online for free, and the 8th one will be up by the end of next week. So, for example, you'll see that episode 3 is specifically dedicated to the program that Steve was talking about, the Family and Natural Supports Model. So if you're curious to learn more about that, that particular episode might be a great starting point. If you want to learn more about our show, you can do so by visiting our website, which is www.preventhomelessness.ca/prevention-matters. You also can just put Prevention Matters with an exclamation point into like a search engine and we'll pop up. Exclamation point is very important though. So yeah, if you just look up Prevention Matters, you can see what we're doing with the show and more of what's to come there. One more thing that I need to plug before I send you on your way is that as we're surrounded by a room full of people who are invested in youth homelessness prevention, yes, Steve, I remembered. We are having a conference next February in Toronto that's focused entirely on the prevention of youth homelessness, and it's bringing in very exciting partners from all across the globe. We'd love to see you there if you can make it, so please, again, visit our website, look up the 2025 Conference on Preventing Youth Homelessness, and it should come up. Yeah, we'd love to learn from you there as well if you're able to join us. Aside from that, that's all I really have to share. Again, thanks to the CAH team for bearing with me in my shenanigans. Everyone, once again, please say a huge thank you to the panelists.
And thank you to Promise and to Erica for mediating, moderating, planning, all of that. Background work. Thanks so much.
So, if you're interested in keeping up with the show and the online one and what's going on there, that QR code will take you to our newsletter where you can sign up to get, super secret cool emails from me. And I'm not saying that if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, you're not one of the cool kids, but the rest of them are kind of also already there. So deductive reasoning, you should probably join them. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks so much for joining. If you have questions about the projects, ask our panelists. If you have questions about the show, come to me. Otherwise, safe travels and thank you for your time.